Hey everyone, welcome to Talks at Google. I'm Matt Bonjovi, and I'm delighted to be welcoming as our guest for today, Charles Clover. Charles is an environmental journalist and co-founder of the conservation charity Blue Marine Foundation. He made his name writing for the Sunday Times and the Daily Telegraph, where he was environment editor for 22 years. His previous book, The End of the Line, called attention to the devastation being caused by overfishing, as well as the global nature of that problem. He transitioned that book into an award-winning documentary film of the same name, a film that is just as important and relevant today as it was when it came out. Charles is here with us this time to discuss his newest book, Rewilding the Sea: How to Save Our Oceans. His book is a revelatory and inspiring look at how to approach what the book refers to as the world's largest solvable problem, the destruction of life in our oceans. The book offers a hopeful look at a promising solution. To reverse the harm that's been done to our oceans, we need to stand back and let nature repair the damage. We'll be getting into the details of how rewilding the ocean works, the challenges that exist in this approach, and the results seen thus far. Now, throughout our discussion, you might have some great questions coming to you, and when you do, please go ahead and add them to the chat on the right. We will have time shortly for Charles to answer some of these, so be sure to get your questions in early. Also, for Googlers watching from London, we have copies of Rewilding the Sea to give away to anyone who asks a question, so be sure not to hold back. But first, Charles, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Matt. Thank you for having me.
So the challenges facing our oceans are broad and I think somewhat well known in the public, but just to put everyone on the same page, can you start by framing what the challenges are here and what the stakes are?
Yes, of course. Well, the oceans are in a pretty bad state, as my last book, The End of the Line, said, and the percentages have gone up a little bit, but roughly 90% of the fish stocks in our oceans are either fully or overexploited, according to the official figures. It may actually be worse than that. And in terms of how well are we protecting the sea, are we doing what the World Conservation Strategy said in 1980 we ought to be doing, which is protecting 10% of the planet's surface in terms of marine? No, we're not. We're on 8%, and it needs to go to 30% in order to have a chance of our existing biodiversity surviving, according to the top scientific thinking. So we're running to catch up here.
Yeah. And when you speak about this percentage of ocean that's protected, what does that mean?
Exactly. So fully protected is a much lower number, around about 2%. These are very large ocean reserves way out miles away from anywhere where very few people fish. So the difficult stuff we haven't yet really got round to doing in most countries of the world. But hey, the thing is, we have started doing some of this stuff, and the results are amazing and fantastic, and dedicated people around the world, some of whom are in this book, have achieved amazing things in the decades since I wrote that book 18 years ago, which was almost universally bleak, and showed that this was one of the unsolved environmental problems. This is an environmental problem we can solve. And if we just did all the good bits and didn't do all the bad bits, we'd be doing a fantastic job, much better than we are dealing with climate change. So it's a hopeful story, this book.
Yeah, definitely. And the idea of rewilding is, I think, fairly straightforward, which is we set aside these certain areas and protect them behind legal or regulatory structures. And we allow nature to do its thing, and we can sort of nudge or support ecosystems where that's relevant. What makes rewilding oceans such an attractive option in tackling these challenges that you're describing for the ocean?
Well, the two things we need are better fisheries management, because we don't have it in half the oceans, and the rest of it's imperfect. And we need to leave more of the sea alone. It's that simple. The way you invest in the oceans is by leaving them alone. That's essentially what Rewilding the Sea is all about, and it is economically beneficial and ecologically beneficial for all of us. It may need some footling transitional money, but honestly, we all gain. So as I've demonstrated through examples in this book, where people have protected things from forms of fishing activity that the fishing industry bitterly defended, and have found that they had 4 times more fish, 4 times more biodiversity. So why don't we do that everywhere around our coasts, is my point. Because it works. Protecting the sea works. That's how you invest in it.
Right. And so what you're mentioning is that we can set aside these areas and prevent certain degrees of fishing happening in them. And when we do that, that actually leads to a more economic fishing situation. Is that right?
Well, there are 2 things. Just to parse that slightly. I mean, if you create a marine protected area, as we have in, for example, Lyme Bay on the south coast of England, which allows fishing, but doesn't allow the most destructive forms of fishing, you will get a very considerable bounce back in biodiversity and fish stocks. But if you want the maximum benefits, you need to protect it totally from all extractive activities. And yes, around the world, there are examples of that producing benefits for the fishing industry, who then fish around the edges in the buffer zones and catch more fish than they did before. And that's what we very much hope will happen now that there are going to be some highly protected marine areas around the British coast, we hope. But also what we hope is that some of the partially but protected but very large areas, like the Dogger Bank, which is the Atlantis of the North Sea. That's a huge area, which the British government have protected from trawling and scallop dredging. We think that you will begin to see overspill effects there, but you need the areas to be big enough to have this investment impact, to have these overspill effects. But the Dogger Bank was where all the cod were. It was where all the plaice were. But they aren't there anymore. I've spoken to a guy who dived the Dogger Bank, a cod fisherman who dived the wrecks on the Dogger Bank. He said they were just full. They were just lined up with cod. And I said, well, what's it like now? And he said, you won't find them there. But after a period of time, this is 12,000 square kilometers. There is some cod left in the sea. They're going to go there, because cod aren't stupid. They know when there are nets trying to catch them. So fish aren't entirely stupid. They will go to where the habitat's recovering, to where the fishing nets aren't coming for them, and then we will see whether we get those grandmother cod that have 10, 20, 100 times more eggs than regular sized cod that fit into a fish box, and we will see amazing things happen. And we've seen amazing things happen already, by the way.
Yeah.
In some of these places, not the Dogger Bank yet. That was about 2 weeks ago, but
right. A bit too soon.
Give it a chance.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about the mechanics of creating these marine protected areas, because I think one of the really compelling threads from your book is seeing how multifaceted that challenge is. And the first aspect I wanted to touch on is how you coordinate with the local communities to decide what the area is going to look like and whether or not there should be one there. So when a project is in these early stages, what does the community engagement piece look like? Are people coming to you saying, let's protect this area, or is it vice versa, or what's that like?
Well, it's a slightly different process, I would say. And more opportunistic one that's happened when we've been involved in it. So it can happen in lots of ways, but it can be concerned communities in places like Ascension Island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean who say, well, we don't fish this, and we notice that other people do, and we've been selling them some licenses for a while, but we've noticed that certain fish aren't here anymore, and we worry about that. And as we don't need to have these people, should we not protect it? So that's that's where there was no commercial fishing fleet. It's a very unusual place, Ascension Island, but it's in the middle of the tropical Atlantic. It's a vast area, sort of somewhere around twice the size of the UK. In terms of its, this little speck owns this huge area of sea, and it's one of the heaviest fished areas of sea in the Atlantic. So that was a real value to the Atlantic tuna and sailfish and marlin and these big animal stocks when it was protected. But going back to the things that people will have seen themselves, the little boat on the beach or the little boat in the port. Very often, and this is the thing that people don't often understand, is that it's the fishermen themselves who are saying, let's protect this. This is what it was like. This is what it is like. Let's protect it. So it's very often an alliance of small-scale fishermen who probably have other incomes, but who do fish for a living, for a large part of their living, and environmentalists saying, this can't go on. So in Lyme Bay, for example, there was one fisherman to whom this book is dedicated, who died sadly earlier this year, who was a great hero of mine. He was called Dave Sales. And Dave campaigned for nearly 25 years to protect Lyme Bay from scallop dredging, which was basically turning the rocky reefs, which harbored all these sunset corals and sea fans and all sorts of stuff that's pretty remarkable in English waters. It's not like a tropical coral reef, but it's as good as it gets for biodiversity in Britain, and therefore we need to protect it. He managed to persuade the government that that was so important that that should be protected. And not a lot of people know that it's fishermen almost invariably who are in on this argument, on the side of conservation. And of course, there are fishermen who are on the other side. But, advocating, we're perfectly all right, we're doing the right thing, we're complying with the law, but we actually want to catch a bit more because we've got a mortgage. So it's the engagement of those two arguments. And what you've got to do is, if you're a conservation group like ours, is listen carefully to everybody beforehand and see which arguments are strongest and where they will prevail, because there are places where they won't prevail. There are places which ought to be the wheat fields where the combine harvesters move up and down in the sea, just as there are on land. There should be places, the fishing grounds are where people should fish, and there different rules should apply. The two things have to fit together, fisheries management and marine protected areas, because fish move. Fish are mobile. They're highly mobile in some cases. They swim across whole oceans. And so you can't protect the world's oceans without having a mind to these two things. Manage the fisheries according to scientific advice, which we don't even do yet in the UK, which is shocking and scandalous, for 65% of the stocks we manage with the EU. That's a huge number. And, leave it alone. And there is one other thing you need to do sometimes. Yeah. This is my definition of rewilding the sea, is all these things add up to rewilding the sea. The other thing that adds up to rewilding the sea is where you've actually fished it out, where you've exhausted it, like the domestic European oyster stocks in the Solent, on the south coast of England. They fished them so disgracefully, and so with a total failure of regulation. In the 1970s, they had 700 people fishing them. In 2013, they had 4 or something. That's the kind of scale of decline. So you can't actually, you could wait for a century for the oyster to come back, and it won't. So you've got to help it. You've got to bring some, and it's been done historically over hundreds of years. You've got to bring some oysters from somewhere nearby, not far away ideally, and put them in, and they will replenish the reef, or so we hope. If they don't, Solent is pretty stuffed. So we just hope that's going to work. And we have every evidence that it is working.
Yeah. And for that example, when you're looking at an environment where you want to take this step, like reintroducing oysters or introducing oysters from a nearby area, what depth of knowledge do you need to have about the environment and the ecology to be able to make that assessment and say, we think it's worth it to try and do this, despite the fact that there is potentially some risk in doing that?
Well, the flippant answer to that is that I had very little knowledge. I'm a journalist. I just listen to what everybody else says. I do a desktop survey of what has ever been written on it. Right. And I write a plan. And that's what I did for the Solent. But, to be absolutely honest, I had spoken to the three world experts on oysters and oyster restoration at that time, but I like things nice and clear, and I wrote it nice and clear and nice and simple. And in the end, we actually got a donor from the United States, as it happens. We have a thing called NIFWIF. I never remember what it actually stands for, but it's a state-backed fund where all the money goes from miscreants in the sea, and it goes back to the people who they think it should go to. And one of the vessels was caught out by the Marine Coast Guard Agency in the UK, and it was leaking in US waters. So a kind of deal was struck. So they read our proposal, and they thought we were doing a good idea. They thought it was a good idea. They thought we were doing the right thing. But funnily enough, the reason why they thought that was a good idea was because the United States had already done it on a massive scale. And so we were really learning from them. We do it with a couple of barges and a digger that's normally dredging the Solent, and a bucket of bleach and a Ford Transit, a white Ford Transit. In the East Coast of the United States, they do oyster restoration with the Navy. And that's how we should do it. And I'm still advocating that we should.
Yeah. Yeah. And you kind of touched in there about like the funding for these projects, and that there's this source where there's punitive money being collected from organizations that have done bad things, and that can then be funneled into these projects. Are there other ways?
That's a one-off. That's a one-off. We don't have that in the UK. I wish we did. I think many of the ways that the United States regulates its fisheries and its inshore waters, and the way it invests in it or in them, are better than we do in the UK. And we've had an opportunity to do things better after Brexit, which we have largely fluffed. So some of us are going to have to challenge the rather inadequate structures that have been set up after Brexit for the UK. But that's just an aside, really. But the US has a very good Fisheries Act, probably the world's best Fisheries Act. Not perfect, not always working. Magnuson-Stevens Act, pretty cool. And some of this oyster restoration work in the Chesapeake Bay and other places has been, world leading. So hats off.
Yeah. And then, so for these UK specific projects, is this entirely government funding? Is this private donors?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. You try to go to France, they say, oh, conservation. Oh, well, it's about whether the government has a budget. And you say, no, it isn't. There are lots of rich people nowadays, and some of them want to save the sea. Do you do that? And they say, no, we don't do it. No, it doesn't compute. So the French do everything as a state thing. So everybody has to have a conversation about what the state's going to do. We do a bit of that, and in fact, that's because the sea is a commons. You have to have that conversation. That's the difference between the sea and the land. Any conservation activity has to be a common purpose about our common inheritance. It's not just one rich landowner deciding to rewild his farm and not somebody else's. This is a common activity. But there are lots of people and lots of companies who want to invest in a better world, and who see the synergies between ocean protection and climate change mitigation, which are beginning to emerge. Some of these habitats that we're protecting, by protecting the fish, protect the habitat soaks up carbon. The numbers aren't very good at the moment. They're getting better. We're spending a lot of money, philanthropic money, trying to get those numbers better so that we can convince more people.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And when an area is protected, what are what's the sort of stick in the scenario where people might violate these protections, or just sort of ignore that this is a protected area? Does that occur? What's preventing that from happening?
Yeah, of course it occurs. It occurs in Lyme Bay. But basically, there is a law, and making sure the law is complied with is quite important. Making sure you've got the technology to see that the law is being breached is important. But ultimately, it's particularly in these sort of regional and community-based projects. It's more of a social thing,
Right.
social disapprobation, shall we say. In one case, and I think this is kind of typical, we knew that a particular boat was going out and scallop dredging at night during the winter when all the regulators' vessels were all tucked up and they were watching the television. And we knew this was going on, but we also knew, because our network of fishermen told us, where they were landing the scallops to. And that was the weak point in their food chain, in their argument, because we went to the man who owned the fish processing factory and said, do not take scallops from this boat. And he found it very, very hard to sell. And eventually they did get that vessel, and I was fined multiple times. But it was really the taking away of the market outlet, because nobody had really approved of what he was doing. That was what worked. And so you have to have something in it for somebody. Right. That's why I slightly worry about, I worry that we need to develop the argument in economic terms for protecting things absolutely in certain places, because in other parts of the world, like New Zealand, there have been enormous benefits for just protecting it. But it's very hard to sell that in a historically overfished sea around the British coasts or the east coast of America. It's very hard to sell that argument. But in other places, in the Mediterranean, even the most overfished sea in the world, it's true. It's true. It has an economic benefit. We have, among one of our projects is a project in Turkey, fished almost exclusively by women for cultural reasons, and it involves no-take areas with buffer zones around, and the economic benefits of no-take in that context have been immense. I mean, huge increases in what they catch, because the Mediterranean doesn't have many fish. They've all gone. Been fished out for thousands of years. So the way to invest is to leave it alone. And leaving it alone is producing now more fish than whatever they caught before.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to quickly jump to an audience question we have from Roxanne, who asks, what are the top 3 things that each of us as private consumers can do to help protect the ocean's biodiversity without entirely scrapping fish from our diet?
Well, I haven't scrapped fish entirely from my diet. Yeah. I don't hold with the vegan argument, because I think you need to favor the few sustainable forms of fishing and let them occupy space and be the eyes and ears. And also, I don't think you can abolish anything that is wrong, that is not wrong. So what can you do? Well, obviously there are the seafood guides. I think we're all changing our minds about some of the things on the seafood guides. I used to think that Atlantic farmed salmon was okay. I now don't, because I don't think any of it's sustainable. I think the impact on the west of Scotland is terrible. And I think it's now led to appalling fish meal plants being built, mainly by the Chinese in West Africa, that are accentuating the already wrong cycle of the circle of hell that overfishing creates. So what can you do? You can eat, a local fish that you know the provenance of. You can eat shellfish, which by and large you know the provenance of, and you know that it's come from a local fishery who's got interest in not overfishing it, lobster and crab. You can eat mussels. Mussels are jolly good. Mussels, clams, things like that, which are low in the food chain in shellfish terms. They're all good. But the other thing you can do, the third thing you can do as an individual is just, well, you could do it by getting a copy of my book, Rewilding the Sea, but just selling the message that you can solve this. And whatever anybody says to you, there are examples now in the world of getting it right. Why don't we just do that? Why don't we just buy the electric cars, not the gas guzzlers or the smelly old Trabants? Why don't we do it this way? Because it's proven to be economically and ecologically better, and nobody can contest that. That's what you say to everyone who asks. So that'd be really helpful. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure Roxanne will take care of that for us. So,
Thanks, Roxanne.
And you mentioned that there's this potential like consumer choice element to it where we can choose to buy from local fisheries or from places where we know the provenance of the fish. And there's now kind of been somewhat of a proliferation of certifications of different types of things. Do you see that as being part of the solution, these larger certifications, or is it more of a...
Well, they started out okay, and they're still doing, well, there's one big one called the MSC, which started out okay about 25 years ago. I was very supportive of it. I helped it to get set up. But it's not been listening to too much advice, and it's now, I think, on the cliff of public credibility, because it's just gone too far the industry's way. It supports fisheries in which observers have been killed in the Pacific Ocean, where nobody has been brought to trial for bumping them off. It's supporting fisheries that are on overfished stocks in the Indian Ocean that just shouldn't be certified. So just be careful when you're buying a thing with a tick on it that you've done a little bit more homework. You shouldn't have to do that homework. And by and large, some of the remedial measures that the Marine Stewardship Council requires in fisheries are extremely good, and we should encourage them. But the trouble is they've gone a little bit over the edge, and their economic model has led them to certify more fisheries than they should have done. And they've got to get a handle on that, and they've got to reform themselves. So it's an indicator, but it's not the holy grail in terms of sustainable fish anymore. I think it probably was. Also, they don't take the remedial actions that they say in the beginning that people should have taken. They don't check up whether people have done them, and usually they haven't. So,
right. And is that just from a political standpoint that they don't do those remedial things, or is it just like there's not the resources to do that? Do you know why that?
They've got plenty of resource. You ask them. I think it's just too heavy stacking of big international fisheries companies on their board. I mean, they don't seem to understand that fisheries are a very serious problem for the world, and the public wants them to make the Marine Stewardship Council deal with those problems and sort of sit idly by and make some money out of it.
Yeah. Yes, we have another audience question that kind of looks at the other side of the coin. So Francisco asks, what actions do you believe government/international institutions should do to prioritize localized fishing? Are there any regions that are hotspots of bioaccumulation where people should avoid fish?
Oh, lots. That's quite a,
Can you solve the whole problem for us right now?
That's quite a big one. There are loads of places which are already terribly overfished that were once very rich. I imagine that the Yellow Sea was, but I'm told it's the most overfished place on earth. I'm told that the South Java Sea is also unbelievably overfished, where there is incentive to go on and on and on to catch the last fish, because people are so poor that that's all they can do. That's all they can spend their time doing, because they have nothing else to eat. And so they will catch the last fish. So that happens in places in the world. But I forgot what the first part of the question was. So that was where you should not.
So I think the first part.
Others.
Yeah, I think the first part was, what should governments and international institutions do to prioritize these localized fishing?
Well, it's curious. It's a very good question, because governments are peculiarly bad at prioritizing localized fishing. And it generally has to be the NGOs and the small-scale fishermen who prioritize localized fishing. That's my experience. Large governments want to deal with large fishing institutions and large fleets. And it's a complete misunderstanding of what they should be doing in the sea, because the way you invest in the sea it's by leaving it alone. So if you are constantly upgrading through often through subsidies, because you're trying to placate this industry lobby, and you placate them by giving them money to build bigger boats, making the problem worse. Because the fishing industry is constantly trying to kill itself. And what government has got to do is to stop it. And if you stop it, it'll have more fish and it'll be happy. But it doesn't necessarily always take this homily to heart. So what you've got to do is phase out subsidies for all fishing. That benefits the small scale fisherman who's going out with using less fuel, going less far. And you've got to, the other thing that affects the big fishermen, that impacts on the little fishermen, is you've got to manage the sea according to scientific advice. Now, it's an example I give in my book, but there are actually many worse ones, or many ones just as bad. In UK waters, for example, 65% of the stocks managed by UK and EU, they give quotas that are above the scientific advice. Now, this is crazy, because that's not how anything is ever going to come back. You're never going to rewild the sea that way. But the fishing lobbies have got themselves into saying, oh, well, you can't stop us fishing just for one stock. Well, I think you can. And that's what happened in the west coast of the United States, where they stopped fishing to protect the ground fish, 75 species, only 2 or 3, maybe 5 species, which were very rare. But now the cod is getting pretty rare in all its populations in the UK and EU waters. We should be prioritizing the cod. And if you can't catch haddock there, I'm terribly sorry. But government's just not had the nerve to say that lately. Though we'll be campaigning that they do, and we've got some nasty things to tell them that might happen if they don't. So we're going to make a big fuss about it, because that's just a disgrace.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier that there's we kind of know what we need to do and what is economically and ecologically successful. Is it the case that those solutions can be applied in lots of different places, or is there a lot of local nuance that makes that difficult?
Well, there's always local nuance. There's different species, and there's a different way of catching it. So there's always a nuance. But by and large, fishing according to scientific advice, fishing within sustainable limits, works everywhere. Protecting areas, large enough ones, works everywhere. And my book is saying, hang on a minute, just take the scales away from your eyes. This is actually what works everywhere. It's not just, it's a global phenomenon. It works everywhere. So don't let anybody con you that some local guy who says he doesn't want to catch cod, but he has to catch cod because he wouldn't catch langoustines otherwise. And he keeps catching all his little cod because that's how you catch langoustines. And then you throw the cod back, but they're dead. Now, that is not a satisfactory argument. You could perfectly well fish using another gear type. You could perfectly well fish with a creel for that langoustine, which crawls into the pot. Cod swims over the top. It is a culturally important way of fishing to certain communities, but it is completely obsolete. It shouldn't happen, and government has just got to be goaded into saying that. It's like coal mining. I'm terribly sorry, but in UK we have pretty much stopped coal mining, and we are an island built on coal because it's bad for us. It's bad for the climate, and it was killing a lot of people, both through their lungs and through their work in the mines. And it ultimately, it wasn't a good thing to do. Now, there's certain kinds of fishing that are in that category. They are the smokestack industries of the sea. And the sooner we stop doing them, the better.
Yeah, and your organization has been putting in place these marine protected areas. And can you tell us a little bit about the successes that you've had and what those results look like?
Well, we didn't, all working in the marine space is coalition working. And it's working with governments, and often it's working with several governments. It's working with the government of the UK and the governments of the UK overseas territories. Now, the UK and its UK UCOTS, as we call them, UK overseas territories, have succeeded in creating the largest network of marine protected areas on Earth. The government is curiously reticent about saying that, because I think it thinks it might have to do rather more if people thought it was that green, but it's or blue. But it's actually done it, and though there are, there are ways in which that 4.2 million square kilometers of ocean could be managed fractionally better, maybe in some places, it's a pretty sound achievement. And it was done by coalitions of NGOs talking to sport fishers and local fishers and other NGOs and government. And all of these things in the sea, as I say, are a matter of coalitions and essentially of democracy. I mean, some of the worst things that go on in the sea come from autocracies. So democracy is quite good at conservation up to a point, except when it isn't. And autocracy is pretty bad for conservation generally. I mean, the Spanish fleet is the size of the Spanish fleet today, and it causes multiple problems because of the massive investment in fishing vessels in the years of fascism, in the years of Franco. Now, they don't like admitting that, but it's the case. That was the imperialistic way that the government of Spain behaved in those days, was to build many more fishing vessels. And when they came into the EU, the Spaniards had half the EU fishing fleet. It was a huge problem. So that's one autocracy. And the other one, the worst one of all, is China, of course, which now has the world's largest distant water fleet, which is in danger of fishing the whole world's oceans out. And that came about because, again, a government without checks and balances, or pretty much any idea of the environment at all, certainly the marine environment, decides to give money to coastal communities to keep them quiet, and build more fishing vessels. And look what it's done. It's something like somewhere between 12 and 18,000 fishing vessels able to fish beyond China's waters. And until quite recently, the Chinese government itself thought there were only 3,600. There's 4 or 5 times that. And it's a huge problem. I hope the Chinese, who are smart people and have just given in to the World Trade Organization, which has finally agreed to limit subsidies after 22 years. And I think that they have decided, there's a bit of a disagreement as to whether this is a good agreement or just a fig leaf. I think it's probably an agreement you can make something of, but it means that China should not now be giving subsidies for the building of vessels that fish overfish stocks. And since most of the world's stocks are overfished, I can't see why we can't hold them to that.
Yeah, and you mentioned that a lot of these are coalitional and democratic, and sometimes the nature of that is that there's backsliding. Do we see any areas that were protected and then become unprotected, or is it generally fairly stable?
I think there are some which we do need to be very aware of. In the Caribbean, people I know have been to them, not me. I mean, where you give people no vested interest in protection, you don't get a very good result. So there are 1 or 2 fully protected marine areas that are poached to hell because nobody derives an economic benefit from it. So they don't get a benefit from the tourism, or don't perceive that there's a benefit from the tourism. And they don't get a benefit, as do the most successful marine protected areas in the Caribbean, from fly fishing tourism. Some of the best marine protected areas in the Caribbean are fly fishing reserves. I've been there. I'm a fly fisherman. I'm thoroughly in favor of it. You put the fish back, and the guides, who are all former fishermen, they're poachers turned gamekeepers. They get paid well. They've got all the right kit, and they catch the poachers. I mean, what's not to like?
Yeah, and I'm also wondering if there's maybe a lack of collaboration on some projects where I think in your book you mentioned there was an example where you were looking for funding for a project, I think the Ascension Island protection, and there was a similar project that the Pew Trust in the US wanted to protect, and that there was maybe sort of a trade-off between those. Do we see those sort
I
of
don't know.
zero-sum aspects?
I think you've got that wrong, actually. I mean, honestly, there's always somebody wanting to do something somewhere. And it's about what I was saying about coalition working. I mean, we get on very well with Pew Trust,
Right.
but we didn't know they got as far as they had with this one. They didn't know we got as far as we had with that one. We put the two together, and the critical mass of these two UK overseas territories, frankly, created the blue belt, because that's a huge area of marine protected areas, because one NGO going for its campaign with a few of its supporters doesn't get that far. Another NGO with its supporters built. But if you put the two together, you've got the kind of snowball going down the hill. That's what I was trying to say there. It's not about competition. It's about building the alliance, building the coalition. So if you've got one that you want to do badly, I've got one I want to do badly. In the world of oceans, in the world of NGO coalitions, what you do is you get together, and that works.
Yeah. And is there also a sense where people's interests in these projects are required, or like, is there a sense of urgency from communities, from people that can support these projects that's needed? Or do you think that sense of urgency is there and it's just about executing on these projects?
It's always easy to get someone to stop plowing the field that has the wildflowers in it, because everybody sees that as wrong. So conservation necessarily moves in that sort of direction. It's capricious, it's opportunistic, and people terribly look down their noses about that. But actually, what's the problem? I mean, if it gets some of the sea protected, we know so little about the enormous powers of regeneration that sea can demonstrate, but we're beginning to discover some, because conservation is very young. It's only demonstrating them now. So protecting any area of the ocean is good, but definitely protect the ones where there is the greatest threat. So what's wrong with that?
Yeah. And is there more that needs to happen in terms of like getting the message out to the public? Obviously, you've been very influential in this space with books and documentaries. Do you think that is a fundamental piece of this mission?
Well, if I thought the message had got out completely, I wouldn't have written a book. So I think the point is, the idea of rewilding the sea, of putting together, soaking up more carbon, letting the sea, we're not doing very well in this quiz game for saving our climate, are we? And we've already got these. We've got a northern hemisphere droughts and fires, and in the summer and then in the winter, in the southern hemisphere we have the same. So we've got a real climate emergency on our hands, and we don't know what to do. So the ocean's your friend. Phone a friend. Just protect all the things that the ocean does that could be helping you soak up carbon, because you better believe it, all the other things are more expensive. So that's number one. And we should therefore be looking all the more at protecting and better managing our fish stocks, which are carbon, by the way, and our whales, which are carbon, and the fish and the whales have this wonderful pump that drives the generation of plankton and so on, so which soaks up carbon. So there are massive synergies between dealing with climate in the sea and dealing with biodiversity in the sea and conserving both to the general good. And I don't think there are too many reasons for not doing it.
So I think as we kind of start to wrap up, I'm curious, what do you see as sort of the main takeaways from this book? I know we've talked about a lot of different things here, but what are the key things that you think people should take away?
We can do it. That's the thing. Marine conservation works. Remarkable people over the last decade or more have achieved some signal achievements. We brought back the bluefin, Atlantic bluefin tuna that was absent and is now being found in the English Channel and the Bay of Biscay, off Ireland, off Scotland, even off Norway. There are some amazing things that have happened. We've protected the Frappus skate, one of the megafauna of the sea off the west of Scotland. Not nearly a big enough area, but we got there in time. This is a critically endangered species. We've created some very large marine protected areas in the world over the last decade, thanks to some fairly inspired people. And we can do it. That's the message. So why don't we do it a bit more?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the book is absolutely inspiring, and the stories that you have of the people that have invested really their whole lives in some of these efforts is very inspiring, and I think does really bring home that message of we can do it.
The people who most inspired me, incidentally, were the 250 inhabitants of Tristan da Cunha. Sorry, I just have to shut this annoying door. There are 250 of them, and they are all of them wholly economically dependent upon a lobster fishery. They decided to protect 2/3 of their waters, a vast area with 4 at least other major islands covered in penguins, albatrosses, and so on, with amazing blue sharks, all sorts of things. And they decided to do it because it was the right thing to do. I wish we all had that vision and that economic driver. I mean, they think that by doing that, they will protect their waters forever and they will regenerate. And I think they're right. And hats off to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Charles, I want to thank you again for being here. It's been an honor getting to speak with you. And Charles's book, Rewilding the Sea, is available now wherever books are sold, including through your local and independent booksellers. It's an important and timely read, and I definitely recommend people check it out. For everyone who joined us today, we look forward to seeing you at our next Toxic Google event. Take care.
Thanks, Matt.